I think one has to accept that polling is probably getting better and better and better, because the polls before the last general election in Britain were phenomenally accurate. The polling data, Labour leads over Conservatives by approximately 20% for nearly 2 years, with peaks over 30% during Liz Truss's premiership, and polls most recently before the election showed the government support between 18 to 19%, with some as low as 15%. So Labour was certain to win in the polls, and did in reality. And in 2019, the Conservatives won by a substantial majority, driven by the Get Brexit Done slogan and Jeremy Corbyn's left-wing stance. Both factors no longer applied. Brexit was complete. Keir Starmer had moved Labour to the political centre. But most importantly, in the factors that drove the British general election were, number one, the incompetence of the Conservative government under 5 utterly useless prime ministers. Now, I say that very carefully. Liz Truss, we know, was phenomenally stupid. Boris Johnson was unbelievably deceitful and revealed as such, so stupid again. Theresa May, incompetent, capable of running through a field of wheat and not much more. David Cameron, probably one of the most proficient and able prime ministers that we have had in 50-odd years. Up there with Harold Wilson, up there with Tony Blair, up there with Thatcher. And yet, at the point when he was tested, at the point when his leadership was demanded, he walked away to a holiday in Nice, putting his feet up in Nice. In the end, he must be judged by his failure and by his record. So, 5 utterly useless prime ministers. 5 prime ministers who, when it came to the crunch, failed. You notice I haven't mentioned Rishi Sunak, because Rishi Sunak was always going to fail. He'd been handed the bad apple. And although I think Rishi Sunak was very competent, he could not overturn that record of one after the other of failure. Brexit, widely regarded as a failed policy. No matter what you hear from the Brexiteers, there is no Brexit bonus. Only 15% of the population believe Brexit positives outweigh the negatives. There is significant public support for rejoining the EU or the single market, particularly if you read documents and newspapers outside the UK. What we hear in the UK is that vocal minority again and again and again that drove the reform vote. But the reform vote is very small. It's enough to knock the Conservatives off kilter, but it's not enough to be a significant and believable movement in the UK. Added to which, living standards, real GDP per capita has stagnated over 14 years of Conservative rule, and NHS waiting lists have grown from 2.3 million in 2010 to 7.6 million, highlighting public service deterioration. The fracturing coalition in the right wing, the Conservatives, have lost ground to Reform UK and to the Labour and the Liberal Democrats. That was certain before the election took place. It was confirmed by the election itself. And Reform UK, headed by Nigel Farage, his sudden decision, he said, or maybe a theatrical coup, was a brilliant way to attract right-wing conservative voters, rising, to significantly defeat any hope of a conservative comeback. I think without Farage, that reform vote may have been smaller, because Richard Tice doesn't have the charisma, or indeed, frankly, the intelligence of Farage, but and Lee Anderson could barely clean a floor. But with Farage, everything catapults forward. I think there is, in addition, another issue: the sheer list of scandal, and you can go through the scandals of each prime minister. The photography scandal of David Cameron, right at the beginning, hiring a photographer on taxpayers' money while cutting public service jobs. Absurd. The go-home advertising vans, Theresa May's controversial campaign targeting illegal migrants, which was later abandoned. The poppy digital edition of a poppy to David Cameron's photograph, causing public outrage. Of course, it was worse than the digital manipulation of photographs of the Patriarch of Moscow's watch. It was worse than the Soviet erasure of individuals next to Soviet leaders. It was worse than the AI photography of the Princess of Wales, because it ties in with nationalism, with the commemoration of the people who had died. And then the Brexit referendum, which has cost the UK 100 billion annually in lost output. The Brexit campaign violations, vote leave, B leave, coordination to overspend, violating electoral law. The point is, if you cheat in an exam, you are disqualified. And, if you cheat anywhere, you are disqualified. If you cheat in the Olympics, you are disqualified. If you cheat in an election in Britain, you get a pat on the back, and you have a ready-made party which will endorse everything that you've done. Reform UK. With Theresa May, the Grenfell Tower fire, and her inability to seize the moment, public outrage at the handling of the Grenfell Tower fire, and public outrage about the huge number of people who have been selling cladding, who are making a mint out of it still. The Windrush scandal, the deportation of long-term residents of the UK due to lack of documentation, which Theresa May shredded. The last scene in Fly Me to the Moon is shredding the documentation for the fake moon landing, which wasn't used in the event. It's a poignant scene, and it's and here you've got a situation where the Home Office shredded important documents, which were people's lives, and they still haven't put it right after so much time. Boris Johnson, the Russian interference, withholding a report on Russian interference in the UK elections and the referendums, and then the controversy over the appointment of Yevgeny Lebedev to the House of Lords, despite national security concerns. The COVID-19 mismanagement, the high death tolls, the inadequate PPE, and Baroness moan. And just madness. Partygate. Attending the parties during COVID, when the government itself had instituted lockdowns, violating the rules that had been imposed by the government violating its own rules. Not just Boris, Rishi was also involved. The Greensill scandal, which arguably is to do with David Cameron, but it turns up during Boris Johnson's tenure, and it involved Boris Johnson's government. The drug use in Parliament. The drug testing that revealed cocaine use in locations accessible to MPs and staff, and then the admission by Gove. The Imran Ahmed Khan, the former MP jailed for sexually abusing a 15-year-old boy, the Owen Paterson lobbying scandal. I think it's the Owen Paterson scandal which is the worst, with Andrea Leadsom trying to overturn a decision by Parliament. I think that is worse even than the scandal of Rees-Mogg going to deceive the Queen. I think the Owen Paterson scandal is the greatest scandal. Not Partygate, Owen Paterson trying to overturn a decision by Parliament, trying to legislate against Parliament. But what Boris Johnson tried with the Owen Paterson, Andrea Leadsom, this person who walked in and out of two lobbies when voting for and against gay marriage, because she could. She voted yes and no. And you think you can trust that sort of person? I wouldn't trust her to... I wouldn't trust her. She was my MP. I remember talking to her, or being talked to by her, because she wouldn't let me get a word in edgeways. I wouldn't trust her to make the tea. And Liz Truss. Only one major scandal with Liz Truss, and that was Liz Truss. Her economic management, her economic mismanagement, her reverence for Kwasi Kwarteng, the stories about her intimacy with various other people in the past. I mean, all that pales into consideration when one thinks about her adoration of Kwasi Kwarteng's prodigious package and her own hand movements that seem to be all over the place and still haven't managed to calm down. And she apparently took lessons for that. She took lessons. Can you imagine the chutzpah, the arrogance, the stupidity of somebody who took lessons and still couldn't get her hand jobs right? And then Rishi Sunak, the unsafe concrete in schools, the Infosys connection, and what else do you have? Chris Pincher by name, Pincher by nature, the food bank usage, up and up and up, Neil Parish watching pornography in the House of Commons, tractor porn, Gavin Williamson, go Gavin, go! Confusing two prominent black athletes, raising questions of incompetence or racism and stepping down over bullying allegations. But we knew, the man with the spider on his desk and Priti Patel bullying again, leading to a formal report finding that she had broken the ministerial code and still she was kept on by Boris and Richard Sharp. Richard Sharp resigning as a BBC chairperson over a failure to disclose his involvement in facilitating a loan to Boris Johnson. These scandals collectively illustrate a pattern of controversy, mismanagement, ethical breaches within the Conservative Party leadership over the past 14 years, severely impacting on public trust and political stability in the UK, and confirming absolutely that the public's decision to throw the party into the wilderness was the right one. This government was not worth saving. This government had reached the end of the line. I cannot believe I cannot think of a government in my lifetime that one would make such a judgment over. No government in my lifetime has proven to be so utterly incompetent. You may not like the Thatcher government. You may not like the Labour government of Blair and then Gordon Brown. You may not like the government of John Major or of Harold Wilson, Callaghan, Edward Heath. But none of them showed the moral inadequacy that became so tangible, as well as the economic incompetence, as well as the constitutional chaos that was created by Brexit. There's not a government in my lifetime, that's 60-odd years, that I can think of that comes anywhere near the failure of the Conservative government that has been consigned to the opposition. I think the public has done the right thing. I certainly don't think it's about the Labour Party winning. But the Labour Party jolly well better make a good show of looking after the country in the next few years, because I don't think the Conservative Party can come back from this level of chaos. My judgment sometime before the election was that the Conservative Party would fracture and be unelectable hereafter. And I'm not convinced I'm wrong. I would be very relieved if I were wrong, because we need a good opposition. Because Parliament is about conversation. It's about debate. It's not about people standing in a room and reciting a speech or giving out slogans. That's what it's become. And we need to change that. If we are to have a serious government, we need to have a serious opposition. And 14 years, maybe 14 years, is too long for any government to be in power. So we need an alternative waiting in the wings. And if that's not going to be the Conservative Party, God help us if it's Reform.